Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Indie Filmmaking Master Class. This is, I guess you're going to call it sort of like a live walkthrough of a screenplay that I wrote called Rosetta Syndrome. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I feel like it's worth talking about in real time as I look at the script and the notes that I created to sort of explain. Hopefully, this is a fairly good example of the way that you can create a screenplay using the elements that you have around you. And I'm hoping to be able to use this script to show you what I had and how I built it into this. So that is what I'm going to do now. So this is the script. It's actually available to download on the site, so feel free to go over and grab a copy. Please feel free to read it. You can always write to me, ask me questions about it. I've actually yet to produce this film, so if you have interest in doing something with the project, even you could contact me about that. But that's less the important thing than talking about what this screenplay is, how it came about, and why I hope it's an example of what you can do similarly to create your project. So the script is called Rosetta Syndrome. A quick plot synopsis, if you haven't read it yet, is basically after everyone wakes up one day with the ability to fluently speak, read, and write a language that didn't even exist the day before, a scientist begins an experiment to discover its origins and discovers a brand new life form. So that's sort of the encapsulation of it. Essentially, the story I told is a story about a guy trying to figure out why everyone is able to speak this new language that didn't even exist previously, and learning that that language is actually a living thing and that it came from somewhere else. It came here. And one of the major themes that I wanted to explore with the story was the idea of empathy. And I essentially had this language as a stand-in for the idea of empathy. Because I feel like in some ways perfect communication does away with the idea of being able to other someone else. And so I wanted to see how the world would react if they suddenly were able to perfectly understand and perfectly communicate with everyone. How would we react to that? Would it be positive? Would it be negative? Would we react violently against it because we would have no way to hide from the truth anymore, that others are just like us? And so those are a lot of the themes I wanted to explore with it. Now, that's the thematic stuff, but there's other stuff to talk about as well, which is why did I pick this particular story and the framework of the way that I wanted to tell it for a fake documentary project? Why did I choose that aesthetic, and why this particular project is going to be effective in being used that way? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump down here to some of the points of why I wrote this story. So here at the bottom, you see the first reason why I wrote this story is because I had access to a location that suited it, right? I'm going to pop back over to the story here. And if you look, aside from a couple of places at the very beginning, blank room, a building wall, and then some places that we cut to, you'll see here. See, Kevin's office is one of the locations, office hallway, office. As you go through the script, what you will find is that almost every location is some sort of I don't want to say nondescript, but sort of like a generic place of learning and or work. And that was intentional because when I wrote this, I actually worked at a college. So like you see here, subject room 1, subject room 2. These are basically just, I worked near a library, and the library had rental rooms that you could rent out where you could study in it. So the reason that was an advantage to me is because it could look like study room, subject rooms, where you would put a person in if you were doing some sort of an experiment, talking to them and things like that. And so I realized, oh, well, all of this stuff is here at the college. Ostensibly for free, because if I can just get permission from people to shoot in certain classrooms or certain rooms, I mean, most of them are rentable places. If you go to the college there, or if, in my case, I worked there, they were free to use. You just had to reserve them. And so I wrote all of those locations, and I wrote several of them, I think 6 or 7 different locations across the campus, because if none of them cost anything, then instead of shooting an entire film in one room, shoot it in 6 or 7 or 8 rooms. If they're all free, and you're able to set up and break down pretty quickly with the equipment, which we are, then you have a situation where you're creating production value for yourself, because it looks like you had all of these different locations. Even though they're in the same campus, it doesn't necessarily read as just being the same thing. And so that helped to create a sense of bigger production value than there would have been otherwise. So that's the first reason that I formatted the story like this. Second one is it allowed me to use stock footage in an interesting way. And I guess the best way to explain that is I'm going to hop over here to the script, and then I'm going to see Control F so I can show you, let me see, montage. So if I look up the word montage here, the first one, it says montage sequence of images across the world, groups of people gathering peacefully, happy shots of the words painted on signs and buildings, all blurred out, right? So what we're seeing here, this montage is essentially, let me see if I can skip to the next one. You can see the next montage. That's a montage of just the characters. I'm looking for, here we go, protests happening all over the world, people painting over letters on the walls of buildings, people being arrested, riots and escalating danger, right? The reason that I created this sort of, I guess you could say, global change with the circumstance of this language showing up and everybody being altered by it is because I realized things that happen on a global scale look similar frequently. And most, well, not most, but a lot of news footage is actually public domain. You're allowed to use it. Certain news organizations, all of the footage that they show in their programs is public domain. So if you can find it in places like archive.org or other places where they post episodes or things like that, any of their footage, that's actually free to use without having to pay someone for it. So you can find all kinds of footage of protests. You could find footage of people gathering somewhere. You could find footage of something spray painted on the wall or someone being arrested. You can find all kinds of footage that seems generic, but if you do what I did here, I'll go back in and I'll type in montage again. What you'll see is one of the tricks that I pulled here is here. You see, as all of these images are happening, the other thing that's happening is we're hearing the voice of the newscaster over it all, right? So what I've done is I've taken a bunch of disparate pieces of information that are not in any way connected in real life, but because of this newscaster voice that I have over the top of it, it is now being connected in a way that makes it seem as if all of these things are related to the one plot element that I've been talking about. Now what I've done is I've taken all this free stuff and I've found a way to assemble it so that it now has a larger purpose in the story, and it looks intentional and it looks expensive. We mined a lot of footage. I actually didn't put it together, but I did once do a demo reel showing how easily it was to do this, to just pull pieces from different places, put voiceover over it. It's actually a pretty simple process. So that's the reason that I chose this global scale sort of story is because it gave me a way to use the stock footage in an interesting way. And also what was really effective and really helpful was that it gives that an enormous scale, an epic scale, because you can find footage from all over the world and you can show that footage from different places, you know, the UK or in Africa or in Mexico or here. And because of that, because you can show in so many different places, it doesn't feel like you're just telling a story with the three people that are shooting in the room that you're shooting in. It becomes this enormous thing. In the same way that all kinds of zombie movies talk about the idea of an outbreak going over the whole world, right? And all you hear is there's maybe a newscast on TV or on radio or something, and everything else we're seeing is just inside this tiny farmhouse, like in Night of the Living Dead. But they give the sense that there's a much larger world by doing those little cheats, those little production cheats, and that's the way that I was able to do that here for essentially no money. So that's another reason we chose this story. Number 3, it was a cheap way to come up with a high concept science fiction idea, right? And I put here a la Primer, Coherence, Traveling Salesman, because those are all examples of very small movies that have huge ideas. And I think one of the things that people frequently forget when they're trying to make movies of any kind is that ideas, at least the creation of the idea, it's no more expensive to have a good idea than it is to have a bad one, right? It's no more expensive to have a complex, interesting, epic, big idea than it is to have a small, uninteresting idea, right? Now, that doesn't mean that anybody can come up with one. However, it does mean that you're not actually spending money on the coming up with of an idea. You're spending money on the turning of that idea into something. So before anything is ever made, when it's cheap, that's the place to be as creative and groundbreaking and original as you possibly can. And in this case, that was my goal. I was to say, we're already trapped in the box of it has to be a small project practically, but it doesn't have to be a small project on the idea sense, right? That can be enormous. If you haven't seen any of these movies, I would highly recommend it, all 3 of them, because even though they're not actually fake documentary films, all 3 of them are films that are made on an incredibly small scale. It's oftentimes single filmmaker doing everything, writing and directing. I think in the case of Primer, he was the star, he was the producer. I think he wrote the music. We're talking about Shane Carruth. So a lot of these movies are great examples of the ways that you can try and assemble something from small pieces that talks about really big stuff. And that was really interesting to me. That's one of the things I wanted to do with the story. So that's another reason I wrote the story. Now, moving on from the why I wrote this story, I want to talk about some of the decisions that I chose to make that I guess you would consider sort of like, let's see what we call them, shortcuts or workarounds, right? These are some creative decisions that I made specifically that were going to help me to make the movie better in some ways, and to either spend less or no money on something and have it not look like that was the decision. Because the worst thing in the world is if you come up with a way to save money on something, but it looks like you've cut the corner to save that money, then that's what it looks like, right? The whole challenge of this concept, the idea of shooting the fake documentary style, is we've already removed the necessity for this film to look like a big budget Hollywood film, right? By mere virtue of the fact that we're saying it's a fake documentary, it has to look like that aesthetic. That lets you off the hook for having to deliver certain things in the film. Now, can we use that same ethos to do things in other ways, still utilizing that aesthetic? Can we make other decisions where we're constantly thinking, okay, what can I do in this moment or in this scene or with this character or with this production element to make it less expensive, but never have that read as a decision to do it specifically, but rather have it work out for us and still have it conceivably organically fit into the storytelling, right? So let's talk about the first one. Number one, a couple of the major characters only ever appear on the phone, right? So let's flip over here. I think, let's see, whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Control F. Melinda, I think is the name of the character, right? So here I'm talking about the character, then the phone rings, I hit speakerphone, and then Melinda appears for the first time on speakerphone. And for every single moment that the character of Melinda appears in this story, she is a disembodied voice on the phone. And that serves, I noted here, see, because of the plot, it seems thematically appropriate, that serves a thematic purpose. Because the main character, the lead, the scientist, the one that's trying to figure all of this out, he is a character who has trouble recognizing clear social cues. He's not great at interpersonal communications. It's we never come straight out and say it. It's clear that not only does he have sort of a bad case of sort of white guy syndrome, where he's not paying attention to obvious clues because he doesn't have to, because he can coast through life, but also that maybe he has some level of being on the spectrum somewhere, even if it's a mild version of it. But because of that, one of the things I wanted to do was have as few people in the story be able to be in front of him and communicate to him clearly. There's the other main character, Kevin, and then him, Chris, named after myself, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then there's two other characters that he recruits for this experiment, but they both are primarily speakers of other languages. So he doesn't understand their main language. So the only way he communicates with them is through this language that we're called Rosetta in the script. And his separated wife, soon to be ex-wife, we don't really know throughout the story. We only hear her voice on the phone as well. So all of these characters are remote. They're removed and kept back from him. So thematically, that's a big connection in the story, because it helps to put the audience in the shoes of not only what he's going through, but also to see how difficult it is to communicate with a person like him. And when I say a person like him, I don't mean because of his disorder. I mean because of his insistence on not paying attention. But what that also does pragmatically is it saves me having to cast a whole bunch of people, right? I mean, obviously, I still have to have someone play the voice on the phone. However, I know people who do multiple voices. And I also know that I could cast maybe one of them as a character on screen, and then they could also be a voice on the phone. Or someone could be more than one voice on the phone, and therefore you could have a single actor portraying multiple roles. So the reason for doing that is that it, again, fits thematically. It expands the world a little bit, because I like the idea that there's not just this convenience that he could sit in the room with any person that he was talking to. You know, this woman, Melinda, that is the head of she works at the National Institutes of Health, I think, or I can't remember. But she's an important character, you know, that's well above him in a government agency. He wouldn't be able to just go sit down in her office and talk to her. And then also the distance between him and his wife, it gives us a strong emotional elements to play with. So all of those things work really well thematically and emotionally for the story, but also it's a good production decision because it allows me to have more to work with without it being obvious that I was doing it for that reason. So the next one, I made the alien in the story a language so that you never have to show the alien, right? Meaning there's no effects budget. The best way to describe it in the script is, let's see if I'm going to put Control F, and then I'm going to put the word living. Did I say that? Here we go. Here. What if Rosetta is the infection? What if Rosetta, the language that we're speaking, is a living thing? That's actually sort of the ultimate reveal of the story, is that this is a creature that lives inside the sort of the comprehension of others. It was, if you've ever seen the movie Pontypool, it was certainly inspired a bit by the idea of the infection in that movie. But in this case, what I wanted it to be was, instead of an infection, it was sort of, it was a symbiote. It lives inside of you, and in exchange for being able to live inside of you, it also gives you perfect understanding of other creatures around you, because you can communicate with it using it as the connective tissue. And in essence, Rosetta, this language, lives inside of my brain and yours. And because of that, because it now has a home, it is the bridge that allows us to connect to each other through communication, through like perfectly understood communication. And that was the hook. But the great thing about that hook is, although it's a really interesting, I think, science fiction concept, just as important as that is that it's super easy to shoot pragmatically, right? From a practical sense, because the alien doesn't have an appearance. So we don't have to have a revelation of what the alien looks like. It doesn't look like anything. In some ways, it's just an abstraction, right? It's not really realistically a concept that could happen, but it's a fun idea. It's interesting, but at the same time saves you a lot of trouble. I don't have to build alien suits. I don't have to build spaceships, right? So I get to have a big science fiction story without any of the other trappings that are required in order to tell one of those big science fiction stories. So I get to have this global phenomenon that is changing the world, and yet I don't have to spend anything on, I don't have to spray paint paper plates silver and hang them off of strings and fly them over sets, So none of this is going to look cheap, because we don't actually have to create anything to get this point across. So that was one of the other workarounds in the shortcuts. The next one, I made the language unable to be recorded on electronic devices. So I didn't have to invent an entirely new language. What I mean by that is, there are places where you see some of the letters written and they get blurred out. And there will be a few places where you'll see the words, but for the most part, the footage is blurring out the letters. And in the world of the story, you come to find out that people believe the language might be evil, and so they think that it's doing something to their brain. And because of the fact that it's doing something to their brain, they don't want to see it. They don't want to speak it. They're afraid that it's hurting them in some way, like there's some sort of infection that's spreading. And so people become paranoid. And so all footage of the language is blurred out on a screen, right? So I did create a few letters, because that's super cheap. To create an alien language is probably not that expensive, right? I literally just have to be kind of creative artistically and just draw some images that kind of look a little bit like letters, but I'm not a linguist. I can't actually write a language, right? These are just some shapes and letters. What am I going to do in the sequences where people have to speak this language? So as a workaround, I was like, I have to have a reason why we can't hear them, or we never see them speak it. Now, it's too obvious to never have them speak it, because then it's clear, they can't afford to create a whole new language. I don't have a guy to hire that, created Klingon or Dothraki or something. What I can do, though, is come up with a plot reason for why you can't hear the language. And so what we did, the premise was, whenever characters are speaking this language, their mouths are going to be moving, but nothing is coming out. So if I were speaking and then I suddenly switched to the language, it would probably, until I went back to speaking English, it mutes itself out. And the reason for that is, I don't have to write a whole new language, but it also serves another purpose. This is a living language. And what we'd established in the story was that it was a camouflage it was using, right? It tries to protect itself by being disguised from recording, from being able to be played back. So it's only something that you can use interpersonally, like human to human. You can't record it and play it back. And in a way, it's sort of like a defense mechanism, in the same way that, like I said, camouflage would be, or any of the other evolutionary traits that animals get in order to protect themselves. And so that was the idea I came up with. And it's a cool plot point, because later, in a very key emotional moment, he tries to say something to someone and have it be 100% clear exactly how he feels. The problem is, he's talking to them over a phone, and they can't understand what he's saying, because Rosetta doesn't work over electronic devices. And so because of that, what ends up happening is that we see how much of a struggle it is to communicate, because even this perfect communication has its limitation. And because of that, we have gotten inside the heads emotionally of the characters in that moment. And it's a really strong thematic moment, and it's really powerful, but it came from a place of using a practical device to save us time and trouble in doing something in the story. So that's another creative workaround. Next one, I named the two leads after the people who probably play them. Now, this has been done dozens of times, hundreds of times possibly in found footage films. The most famous example is obviously going to be the Blair Witch Project. They named the 3 leads after the actual actors that played them, and they did the whole thing where they put out the flyers that the people were missing, and because they were using their own names, there was this question about, did it happen, did it not really happen, and so it was a smart decision on their part. But the reason that I did it is not because we're looking for anybody to necessarily buy into on that level that it's really happening, but it does help when you're working with people who are maybe not professional actors or people who have had a little bit of acting experience, but not a lot. One of the things that's a huge help is if you're acting for the first time, you're also doing other things, because a lot of times on sets like this, like I was going to be playing the lead character and I was also going to be co-directing, and I wrote the script. I'm doing a lot of jobs. It's kind of hard sometimes to segment in the moment, plan what you're doing, talking to the people around you with their real names, and then once everything is set and up behind the scenes and you have to jump into the movie, you have to switch brains. It's hard enough remembering your lines and doing the emotion of the character. On top of that, remembering that you have to now call Kevin Jim, and now you have to call somebody else. So what I do is, but just by having those names, then the good thing is, as long as you continue shooting, you're never going to accidentally call someone a name other than their actual name if you name them that. You will have many mistakes sometimes where I was supposed to call Kevin Jim and I called him Kevin, but you're not going to have the reverse, right? If you just name Kevin, you're not going to accidentally call him Jim, because where would that have ever come from, right? It saves you on certain mistakes like that. It also helps subconsciously, I think, to create a sense of, the person whose actual name it is that you're talking to, and it sort of helps you build a sense of familiarity, even though you're playing characters. It is still that sort of borrowed sense of familiarity. And I find that can be helpful when you're trying to capture performances from people who don't do this for a living. So that's the reason we made that decision as well. And then the last one here, I used a framing device for the story. I'll jump back over to the script and I'll actually go all the way back to the beginning so you can see what I'm talking about here. See where it says interior blank room night. We don't know who this character is, but he's talking. And we get this sense from the character that there's some sort of serious thing that has transpired, some sort of crazy thing that's happened in the world, but we're talking in sort of, it seems like further down the road. It's not like yesterday this thing happened, but it's like it's been a while. Like literally, they say people have gotten comfortable, they've forgotten, right? And so what we discover is that this character, this blank, faceless character, is telling us a story in the past tense. So all this footage that we're seeing is being assembled to show us something. And that serves a couple of purposes. The first one I wrote here. See, it says to create a mystery. Well, obviously that's the first and maybe most obvious and most blunt thing that it does, aside from get a little exposition across, is we don't know who this character is and we don't know the thing that they're talking about. So we have this dual mystery of moving forward, not only of what is this big deal that he's going to be describing to us, but also who is this person. So we have this dual mystery moving forward. But the other thing that I think, I guess it does several different things, but I think one of the things that it's most effective in doing is creating a sense of a larger world and a larger concept of A, who's telling the story, B, why is the story being told like this, and then C, maybe the most important thing, which is what's the explanation for why the film is formed like this? Why are there these montage clips of news things that are happening around the world? Why is all this footage that this guy shot as he was doing this subject, why is this assembled the way that it is? Well, right from the very beginning of the film, I've already explained the purpose for any of this footage of existing, meaning the footage that these characters shot originally, but also why they would edit any of that other footage in. Because one of the most frustrating things people find often with a fake documentary is, sure, all of this could possibly have been shot, but who put this together? Why did they put it together for this purpose? Where did this random footage from this random camera come from? Things like that. And so the premise of doing this wraparound was to both have an emotional beginning, like that hooks you into this greater mystery, sort of the imperative of solving the puzzle box, but also explaining itself, getting rid of the need for having to say, oh, here's why or where this came from, because we have this bigger picture of what all happened. So ultimately, those are the things that I wanted to share with you. Those are the creative workarounds and shortcuts that I came up with for this script, and then the reasons why I wrote them. And my hope is in watching this and then reading the script, or doing it the other way around, however you feel works best for you. My hope is that what you would take away is every decision that you make when you're working on creating a story before you shot it is everyone can make a huge difference. Some of these don't seem like big deals, right? Like this idea here about making the alien a language. That is an enormous deal when you think about it. The amount of money that we saved by making that decision is huge. The idea of naming leads after people who would probably play them also doesn't seem like that big a deal. But all of these little decisions that you make the entire way along, all of them have enormous repercussions, right? All of the ramifications of those decisions will spill out through your project. And so one of the reasons why I formatted the class the way that I did to reverse engineer a project is because usually a film project solves its problems by throwing money at it once you're already moving and a problem crops up. We have to do it the other way around. We have to try and solve every potential problem before we build the project. And so that's why going through all of these pieces and showing you this isn't just that, oh, this is a good project because all of these things happen to be in this script. I did all of these things intentionally. All of these were decisions that I made consciously with the goal of saying, here's a completed screenplay that's going to be so much easier to make than other projects that were just written on spec. It's going to be more effective for how much money and time we have, and it's going to utilize things that make it feel like a bigger project than it actually is. So that's the overall reason that I wanted to make this video, and I hope in reading the script that you get a sense of that. If you read the script and you have any other questions about stuff, or you'd like to understand my frame of mind in writing it, and something that wasn't covered in this video, you can feel free to reach out, and I'm glad to talk to anybody about it, because I think stuff like this is sometimes better, a better help practically than the book is when it talks about, in broad terms, about what we want to do versus what I actually did here. So I hope that's a help, and if you have any questions, like I said, you know how to find me. I hope to hear from you. Thanks.